everybody? Recording live from somewhere. This is Zach Couples with episode number 118 of the Movement Debrief. And today, folks, don't worry, Big Z's got you back. Literally. Because we're going to talk about all things spine. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, we are deep diving into the spine. Compensatory things, good exercises, all types of wild and crazy stuff. Because your boy Big Z has got a bunch of questions that have been asked by the people. They'll be answered for the people by this people right here. Fam recognized fam. Without further ado, let's debrief, shall we? The first question comes from also a Zach. And yes, folks, this Zach spells it Z-A-C, which is the correct way to spell Zach, in my humble opinion. Here's what he asks. Hey man, what's the deal with this? When I inhale, the diaphragm descends and ideally the sacrum counternutates to accept the viscera and the pelvis mechanics follow. Let's talk spinal inhalation. Lumbar spine should accept some of that viscera and expand posteriorly, i.e. reverse the lordotic curve. Otherwise, counternutation wouldn't happen. So far, so good. Should the rest of the spine move into flexion, or would the spine move into more extension at the thoracic spine? I just heard that someone would say the T-spine should extend upon inhalation. And I was torn. So I'm like, I got to ask ZC about this. I'm thinking lower ribs would bucket handle, sternum would pump handle, scaps should abduct, upwardly rotate in IR. If so, what's the dealio? In terms of what the spine should do, in theory, if I'm breathing in and my goal is to create multi-directional expansion of the ventral cavity, thorax, abdomen, pelvis, from a spinal perspective, the spine should move posteriorly to accept all of those forces. So in the thorax, the lungs should fill to some degree posteriorly. The viscera, as Zach alluded to, should move the spine posteriorly as well. So there should be a reduction of the lordotic curve. However, some people do suggest that the thoracic spine extends to some degree because, and the reason why this would be, is due to the pump handle mechanics. So then the question is, well, okay, is the thoracic spine extending? Is the thoracic spine flexing? What's going on, Z? The answer has to do with location, location, location. Let's unpack that. There's two good articles. The first one is, and I'll link them in the show notes, which will be found on zachcouples.com / I don't know where the slash goes, but the / spine. Respiratory action of the intercostal muscles, that's the first one. And then the OG one, like if you want to learn respiratory mechanics, this is the Bible. And it's, of course, by the respiratory Jesus, Andre de Troyer, Mechanics of the Respiratory Muscles. Like, get that article, peep it. I think it's free. Like, I would read it, although it is super in-depth. They have like math and stuff. Woo, woo. I get a little chill just thinking about it. The primary muscles that expand the rib cage would be, or that are active during inhalation, would be the external intercostals. Now, the external intercostals surround the entire rib cage, and believe it or not, there's actually has been a bit of controversy over the years in terms of what these muscles are doing. Some people even argue that they're just there to maintain rib cage stiffness and there's not a whole lot of expansion going on. These articles here, though, beg to differ, and they seem to be the most up-to-date explanations for figuring out what the intercostals do. And the answer in terms of where intercostals create expansion in the rib cage has to do with their location. Based on their location, there's selective neural drive in terms of which ones are active during inhalation, the externals, and which ones are active during exhalation, the internals. When we're talking about inhalation, there's two main areas that the intercostals are active. The first would be on the front side of the body, namely the peristernal intercostals. The second area where these intercostals are active would be posteriorly. And in fact, the dorsal back rostral, highest to the neck or head, highest to the head intercostals. When you hear dorsal rostral expansion, that's what they're talking about. It has to do with the location of these intercostals. The way the external intercostals work during inhalation is based on that neural drive. They are most active in the dorsal rostral region of the thorax, which is like rib 6-ish and above, and then the ventrocaudal part of the front of the thorax. Without a bunch of jargon, basically the uppermost part of the back and the lowermost part of the rib cage will expand during inhalation. If we extrapolate that to what the thoracic spine is doing in general, if I'm getting lower anterior rib cage expansion, i.e. the pump handle, it's going to move anteriorly and superiorly upon inhalation, but in that region of the thoracic spine, as the rib cage moves anteriorly and superiorly, the lower part of the thoracic spine is going to have to move in the opposite direction. So you essentially get like a posterior tilting of the lower part of the thorax. The reason why I don't like extension and flexion is because we can't necessarily say what's going on intersegmentally. The upper parts of the thorax are going to be more flexion biased. The lower parts of the thoracic spine, I should say, are going to be more extension biased in this regard. Where does it separate? Lower part of the thorax is going to tilt posteriorly because of the pump handle mechanics and the increased activity of the parasternal intercostals. Parasternal meaning around the sternum. As I move upstairs, that's where I have increased dorsal rostral expansion. The ribs expand posteriorly and superiorly from, we'll say like T6, 5 and up. In this case, you have a reverse action. The posterior upper thorax is going to move more posteriorly and superiorly. And because I have less intercostal activity in the higher parts of the rib cage, I'm not going to have as much pump handle. So what you have is actually like an anterior thoracic tilt in that region. So I almost have like an alternating posterior thorax tilt, which could contribute to some appearance of extension in the lower part of the thorax or the thoracic spine. And then the upper part of the thorax, I almost have an anterior tilt, which is going to contribute to that posterior expansion. The sum of it overall is creating that multi-directional expansion you should see in the rib cage. But with my lower thoracic spine tilting posteriorly, creating a little bit of extension, and my upper part of my thoracic spine creating that degree of flexion, the sum of the thorax is going to be moving backwards. Because moving backwards in the lower part of the thorax is to some degree extension. You have to look at the way that the thoracic curve changes. And then as I expand in the uppermost parts of the thorax, because it's tipping backwards, it's going to appear as though it's more expansion posteriorly. You'll have a greater increase in the thoracic curve. And that's really what we're seeing when we're talking about thoracic expansion during breathing. Let me recap that real quick. As I breathe in, dorsal rostral, the upper parts of the posterior ribs, or those intercostals, are going to expand posteriorly and superiorly. That's going to push the thoracic spine backwards. In the lower part of the thorax, in the thoracic spine, the ventral caudal intercostals, parasternal, are going to be active, and that's going to move the rib cage anteriorly and superiorly on the front. That's going to create some degree of thoracic extension. But due to the shape of the thoracic curve in those respective areas, even though I have increased thoracic extension in the bottom parts of the thorax, the sum is still moving the rib cage posteriorly. Hence, you're still getting some posterior expansion. And that's why it's not always useful to think of expansion in the spine as relative flexion versus extension, because it depends on what location of the spine we're talking about. And as you can see, in the thoracic spine, it is broken down even further into specific parts of the thoracic spine. That's piece one. Piece two, what is going on with the scaps in this case. Because of those combined actions, the scapula will move into abduction, downward rotation, external rotation, and a posterior tip. Basically, the scaps are going to match what the innominates do when I breathe in. If I look at my pelvis, which I got here, aka my son because he's got the full legs, the pelvis itself is going to tilt posteriorly because of the increased sacral counternutation and lumbar flexion or reduction of lumbar curve. But the innominates, when I perform counternutation of the sacrum, are going to rotate anteriorly, which is flexion, abduction, ER. If I look at this innominate, if I look at the ASIS as being analogous to the coracoid process in the scapula, this is going to rotate downward, or it's going to orient towards the ground, much like I see at the scapula, hence that downward rotation. Another thing to think about is the pec minor helps elevate the ribs 3 through 5 during inhalation, which is also a downward rotator. Another reason why the scapula would fall into downward rotation. But the reason why I don't necessarily have internal rotation and upward rotation is because you can't look at ribcage expansion under normal circumstances as being one piece at a time. What it really is I'm getting circumferential expansion, and the sum of that circumferential expansion, because of lower anterior thorax expansion and upper posterior thorax expansion, the sum of that leads to the scaps moving in that direction. To provide an overall summary of your outstanding question, Zach, when I breathe in, the primary areas in the thorax where I get the most expansion will be upper back, like T6 and above, and lower front, the lower parts of the sternum. When I get combined expansion of those areas, that does lead to a relative posterior tilt in the lower part of the thorax, which would lead to some extension in the lower part of the thoracic spine, and an anterior tilt in the upper thorax, which would lead to some flexion in the upper thoracic spine. The combined action of those two things in the thoracic spine is to move the whole bad boy posteriorly so you can fill the posterior aspect of the lungs, but realize that the pump handle is occurring simultaneously. With that in mind, the scaps are going to mimic what the innominates do in the pelvis during inhalation, which is abduction, external rotation, downward rotation, and a posterior tip. Awesome question, Zach. The next question. This one has been a popular question. It comes from Tim and Nick. Yes, folks, 2 people asked about this one. And we're talking about Dowager's hump or Dowager's. I forget how it's pronounced. Whatever. Hey, Zach, I have a possible debrief topic for you. I'm struggling to understand what could be going on with a Dowager's hump. Could you explain what you'd expect to this going on with it and what the expected limitations would be on the table? Maybe some initial exercise prescription based off of expected limitations. Thank you so much. Have you ever seen someone who has such a severe forward head that the upper part of the thorax looks like it flexes over like crazy, and you got like a little hunchback thingy going on? That, folks, is a Dowager's hump. What's going on with a Dowager's hump? Is this like a crazy amount of kyphosis and I have to work on things to create thoracic extension and life is good? The answer is false with a little bit of an asterisk. Let me unpack that. What you often see in people with a Dowager's hump is the reason why I have such a drastic move into kyphosis in the uppermost parts of the thorax is because I have such an exaggerated exhaled or extended starting point that I'm starting from. A lot of times with people who have a Dowager's hump, you will see an incredibly flat thoracic spine, an exhaled thoracic spine. And then as an attempt to create some degree of inhalation in the posterior thorax, and really it's at the upper thorax, lower cervical spine, you'll see this steep curve. So it starts by having an incredibly exhaled thoracic spine in the mid to lower parts of the thorax. Think of it this way. My body is always trying to counteract things front and back. From a breathing standpoint, if I have an exhaled presentation, I still have to get air in somehow. Here's how they try to create that in the posterior thorax. If I can't get air into the upper back, and we'll say like T3 on down, the way I can try to create a pseudo inhalation strategy into the upper part of the thorax is actually by increasing my concentric strategy up top on the front. If, folks, I create an exhaled or a concentric strategy in the upper parts of the anterior thorax, the manubriosternal joint, which if you want to deep dive into that, check out my last debrief. I'll link it in the show notes. But if I create an exhalation strategy at the manubrium or the manubriosternal joint, boom, and I compress this as far as I can, what that's going to do is it's going to create flexion, or that inhalation-based strategy in the uppermost parts of the thorax. And you essentially have a hinge into flexion and the head dumping forward at those segments. The manubrium predominantly impacts, if we look at the levels and the ribs that attach, you have T1 and T2 in terms of ribs, or the first and second rib. And then the location of manubrium is roughly like T2 to T4-ish. So if I create this hard exhalation strategy in that part of the sternum, I might get some degree of expansion in the uppermost parts of the ribs. But what does it look like? Boom. You get this huge kyphosis at those couple segments. The head shoots forward, and then I course correct by driving a significant amount of OA extension. And that, folks, is likely the reason why you would get a Dowager's hump. It is a concentric strategy in the posterior thorax superimposed by a concentric strategy into the uppermost parts of the anterior thorax, driving the head way forward and creating like an inhaled or a flexion-based position in just a few segments of the uppermost parts of the thorax. Now the question is, what the heck are you going to do about it? The answer would be to create expansion or an eccentric strategy in the areas where I have a concentric strategy. In this case, it's going to be the lowermost parts of the thoracic spine and the uppermost parts of the anterior component of the thoracic spine. How do I do that? The first line of defense for these people would be to teach them normal respiratory mechanics. The way you would do that is by teaching them to stack. I need to improve lower rib cage dynamics and be able to get the pelvic diaphragm to be stacked on top of the thoracic diaphragm. That's the only way you're going to have the potential to get multidirectional expansion into the lungs. If you can't stack, don't talk to Zach about your Dowager's hump. So get that first. Once you have that, then we got to look at expanding into specific areas of the thoracic spine and the rib cage. If I'm exhaled or compressed or concentric in the lowermost parts of the thorax, what I need to do is I need to create expansion there. For that, we can use reaching to achieve that goal. If I need to increase expansion in the lower parts of the thorax, I'm going to keep my reach as 0 to 60. If you want to dive into the why, check out my reaching theory and practice debrief, which will be linked in the show notes. But I'm going to reach low. I'm going to reach 0 to 60 to create that expansion into the lower parts of the thorax. As I do that, I want to make sure that I do not create a bend at the sternum or I flex my spine over. I'm reaching while keeping the chest parallel to whatever surface I'm facing. That's piece one. Piece two, once you have expansion there, I need to be able to get air into the uppermost parts of the thorax. You really have two options. The option I would recommend first and foremost is to create some inversion so it's easier to fill the uppermost parts of the lung. The reason why that is, if we look at my Clean Canteen water bottle, brought to you by, I wish, but if Clean Canteen wants to send you boys some buck, hey, we could update some cameras, get some better audio. Who knows, maybe I'll get a facelift, whatever. But if my water bottle is My person, the water is in the lower part of the water bottle. Trust me, it's not full. If I invert that person by having the pelvis, which would be the bottom part of the water bottle, up higher than the top part of the water bottle, the lid, as I tip this over, the upper part of my water bottle is now getting filled with water. Or if I go completely upside down, then it's going to be completely filled with water. Choosing an exercise where the pelvis is higher than the thorax will allow, in this case, the lungs to fill better in the uppermost regions. When I'm standing, the lungs fill bottom up. If I invert myself, they will better fill top down, which, if I'm compressed or concentric in the uppermost parts of the thorax, I need that. Let gravity help us out in that case. That would be one example. Another way you could get increased A to P expansion would be reaching from 120 to 180 in terms of shoulder flexion while maintaining some degree of external rotation at the humerus. The only issue with that is you have to consider a lot of the people who have a Dowager's hump are going to be the older population. And that's just because with time, the spine changes. And it's going to be harder for them to maintain that amount of shoulder flexion whilst keeping the stacked position. So that's where it becomes a bit more challenging. If you've done those things and you still notice that the Dowager's hump is severe or you're not getting much change, you might have to look into some upper cervical or some cervical spine or even craniofacial fixes for that. Because it could be that you have a person who's getting into this position to maximize airflow and they might have some type of restriction in the upper airway that's contributing to that. That discussion probably goes well beyond this debrief because we ain't got that much time, fam. But what I would encourage you to check out is I did a great review of a myofunctional class that I took that really dives into the upper airway. It'll be linked in the show notes. I would strongly encourage you to check that out because that is an untapped place that we could go to improve one's ability to have a normal upper airway. Also, if you haven't noticed, I'm part of this online sleep summit, which I think is happening next weekend. I'm talking a little bit more in depth in terms of how to apply myofunctional therapy to improve upper airway. I would strongly suggest signing up for that because it's free. And there's a lot of great people speaking on that. To summarize your great question, Tim and Nick, how does a Dowager's hump happen? If I have compression in the mid to lower part of the thorax and I compress the uppermost parts of the anterior thorax, that's going to create a hinge in the thoracic spine into flexion and shove the head forward. The solution would be to stack first, get mid to lower expansion by using low reaches, and then expanding the uppermost parts of the thorax by either inverting that person or by reaching from 120 to 180. If you've done those things and you still got the Humpty Dump thing going on, then you might want to look at improving upper airway dynamics. This could be achieved by myofunctional therapy or a wide variety of other ways. Thank you for the awesome question, Tim and Nick. Sudhakaran.rs, I hope I pronounced that well. Is it okay to sit in flexion when we sit? Sitting. Yes, it's okay to sit in flexion. It's okay to sit perched. The key with sitting and the problem with sitting is anytime I'm in a sustained posture for long enough, something is going to be problematic. The best posture is one that's constantly changing. So if you're going to be sitting for prolonged periods of time, I encourage you to get up, move, change positions, shift around, fidget. That's the best course of action. There's nothing wrong with sitting slouched. It's when I sit slouched for an extended period of time that the tissues might become ischemic or have a reduction of blood flow to them, and then they can become angry. That's my company line on sitting. The next question comes from Javier Larea. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly, Javier. Sway back posture. Is that a similar compensation to the Dowager's hump? It is to some degree. What happens with a sway back is the thorax has to shift posteriorly and the pelvis shifts anteriorly to some degree, and that's what creates the sway back posture. That can often occur via similar mechanisms. So essentially, the upper part of the thorax moving posteriorly is because I have so much concentric activity that's tipping me forward. I don't want to fall, so I'll move my thorax posteriorly. And then in the lower parts of the spine, I might be falling backwards, so to speak. So I have a lot of concentric activity in the posterior aspects of that region. Then I translate my pelvis forward to mitigate that. It's a lot of counterattacks like this beats this sort of thing. The next question comes from Andy. Here's what Andy asks. Does restoring a more neutral lordosis allow for better spine rotation naturally, or do you have clients perform bottom-up and or top-down rotation mobility exercises? Good question. In terms of a neutral lordosis, neutral spine is kind of a mythological thing. There's a great article called The Lumbosacral Mechanics During Back Squatting. And what they looked at in this article was they did some deep measurements on terms of spine position. And as soon as a barbell was put on a person's back, the lumbar spine became kyphotic, and you couldn't necessarily detect that with the naked eye. Also too, because of structural differences, because like with these infrasternal angle presentations, this is a structural bias. There's a great article by Torres Tamayo et al. Called The Torso Integration Hypothesis Revisited. Check it out. It goes into how certain ribcage presentations can occur based on where your ancestors are from. Pretty cool. But that's going to change the positioning that I have in my spine based on my structure, my body structure, and that's totally normal. The goal is to restore dynamic capabilities within that structure. I'm going to assume, based on your question, Andy, that when you're talking about restoring a neutral lordosis, do I need sagittal plane first or do I go after transverse plane first? Well, the planes kind of work together. I would think about restoring easier movements first, which is more sagittal bias, before throwing in rotation. For example, let's talk about the difference between achieving a stack versus achieving a hip shift, because that's really what's going to drive the rotation in this case. If I look at the lumbosacral region, if I do a posterior tilt of the pelvis, which is a key piece to the stack, I'm going to counter-nutate the sacrum. Both sides of the sacrum are going to tip posteriorly. That's easier than me rotating the spine, let's say to the left in this case. When I do that and the sacrum rotates along with it, I have increased counter-nutation on the left side of the sacrum, and on the right side, I'm going to have increased nutation. That's going to force me into a more extreme position than if I just drive counter-nutation bilaterally. When I create that asymmetry, I take up further degrees of freedom in one position. It's easier then to teach someone to move in a more sagittal biased position than a rotational biased position. That's really why I harp so much on making sure you achieve a stacked position first and foremost, because it's easier. And then when people throw in hip shifting or trunk rotation or whatever, if you do that, it's a lot easier to cheat. Because with that, I have to not only maintain the stacked position, but then I have to put myself in an end range position to try to achieve the movement that I'm trying to do so. And when I try to push those end ranges, it's easier for me to fall into compensation if I can't put my body there. If I can't get my body into a position it's not normally accustomed to, you will attempt to compensate in some way, shape, or form. To summarize, when I'm talking about sagittal versus rotation, when I rotate, I have to take up more extreme measures of motion versus doing just a sagittal biased activity. That's why it's easier to do the sagittal action first if we're talking about pelvis and lumbar spine, i.e. the stack, before it is to create a shift. I would strongly encourage that you go in that order and take your time maximizing your ability to create a stacked position. If we're talking about restoring sagittal plane motion, the gold standard would be maximizing your squat depth. If you can get below parallel, that's usually when I try to incorporate some shifting in my clients. Awesome question. Bates Michelson, hopefully I pronounced your name right. Do you ever see issues with excessive flexibility into lumbar flexion as an adaptation to a concentric strategy in the thorax? So good question. If you could, let's think about this. If I have increased lumbar flexion, that would move my body posteriorly, which I might do that as a consequence of me falling forward anteriorly. So if I have a shift of the body moving anteriorly, i.e. I have concentric activity on the anterior parts of the thorax, I could totally see me shifting my body posteriorly or trying to create an excessive amount of relative kyphosis in the entire spine as a secondary consequence. These things become an issue if there's a loss of movement options. So you would still go under the same treatments that I would recommend. Make sure you get the stack first and foremost, because that's going to allow you to drive normal dynamics wherever you need to. And then usually I recommend driving inhalation mechanics at the spine first, if they have a restriction there, followed by exhalation mechanics. The next question comes from Jay. Here's what Jay asks. I'm wondering about the role of the lower traps in relation to the compression of the upper back and lower neck, like I have. I watched Bill Hartman, talk about I's, T's, and Y's being counterproductive in a wide ISA. People are compressed up top. But there are situations in which lower traps can be useful for such people. The normal PTs always say that to use lower traps to help shut off the upper traps, and I'm wondering what mechanism they're even referring to. The lower trap, which runs from T5 to T12, its action at the spine is going to be more compression. I'm going to restrict my ability to get air then in this case to, if I'm doing activities that increase lower trap recruitment. So that would be Y, T, I as an example. When is lower trap useful? Lower trap is predominantly an upward rotator of the scapula. So if I need to restore upward rotation, I might need lower trapezius. What example would that be? If you have someone who has expansion from T5 to T12, and your tells would be if they have like full external rotation at 90 degrees, but they have a loss of expansion in the upper parts of the thorax, talking T1, T5, you might need lower trapezius to create that expansion. Or think of it this way, I just need to do expansion into the uppermost parts of the thorax, which would require some degree of upward rotation of the scapula. The reason why I need scapular upward rotation is because your rhomboids, which run from C7-ish to T5, are downward rotators. So if I'm more downwardly rotated, I'm going to be more concentric in that region, and I won't be able to get expansion there. I'm going to have to pre-position the scapula into upward rotation to maximize my ability to expand in that region. If we're talking about Y's, T's, and I's, in order to minimize compressive strategy in the spine totally, I might do those from a single arm fashion. That way I can drive some rotation and encourage expansion a bit more effectively. That would be the example that I would think about utilizing lower trap to encourage the dynamic restoration that we are searching for. It becomes an issue when I do these things bilaterally, because when I do bilateral Y's, T's, and I's, and I lack the stack, I lack my ability to expand mid to lower posterior thorax, that's when your classic Y, T's, and I's could be counterproductive, Jay. To summarize, you can use lower trap when you have the stack position, you can get mid to lower posterior thorax expansion, and you need to create expansion in the uppermost parts of the thorax. If you got that, trap all day and night like your favorite rapper. Awesome question. The next question comes from my man G-Easy. Here's what he asks. Thoughts on the cat-cow or cat-camel exercise? Useful for breathing mechanics? Useful for fluid slushing? Great question. For those of you who don't know what the cat-camel is, I'll link a video of it in the show notes. But basically that's where you're forcing your body, not forcing, but you're moving your body into extreme amount of flexion through the spine and then going into extreme amounts of extension. This activity could be useful if I'm not doing this move and hinging at specific segments. For example, if we go back to the Dowager's hump discussion earlier, that person may not be able to get air into the mid to lower parts of the thorax, so they create a hinge action in the uppermost parts of the thorax. Your boy, for example, when he goes to bend forward and touch his toes, do not show me where the wild goose goes. I hinge, you can kind of see that I have like a hinge position in the middle part of my thorax. When I go to bend forward, it's basically like flat from the lumbar spine to like T7, 8, and then I like flex at T6, 7, 8, and then I just, flat up top. So when I do something like a cat camel or a cat cow, I can't get that crazy amount of uniform flexion that I so desire. But you could, in theory, as I breathe into those positions and you feel stretches where you need to, create some expansion that could be useful for some people. But if you have someone who's super stiff in the spine and they can't get the expansion desired wherever you need it, it might not be the best move. I would encourage you drive focal activities that get air where you need it, whether that's if it's in like the lower lumbar segments, driving more counter-nutated positions, if it's in the mid-thorax, you're doing low reaches, or if it's upstairs, you're doing high reaches. Get that first, and then I could see the cat-cow exercise being a useful way to exploring those new ranges of motion. Or if you use the cat-cow exercise, make sure you coach it well so that you can get the spine to move in the way you need it. And if you can do that, it actually could be a useful way of encouraging expansion into those regions. It's not a move that I've been programming for my clients lately, but that doesn't mean that I won't use it in the future. One of my favorite moves that I've been using a lot now is the reach, roll, and lift. And no joke, it's been a few years since I've used it. I could totally see myself utilizing the cat-cow for someone in the future. To summarize, your great question, G-Easy, is the cat-cow useful? If you can create movement throughout the spine as you're doing it and you're not hinging at specific segments, it could totally be a useful and worthwhile activity. If I were to use it, I would probably encourage getting air into specific regions where I'm limited first, and then once I've done that, then I'm gonna be in business. Great question, my man. The last question comes from Nikos Sara. Here's what Nikos asked. Hopefully I pronounced your name correctly. Zach, question. How would a spinal fusion affect one's breathing? Great question. Well, basically, the long and the short of it is it would limit your dynamics to some degree in the spine, and it depends on what position you are fused in. I've worked with a few people who've had fusions in my day, and one of my buddies who's got a fusion, he's got an incredibly kyphotic lumbar spine. And in his case, he can't create exhalation-based mechanics. How do I know that? My man's got like minus 40 degrees of hip extension, so he can't get his sacrum into nutation to drive hip extension. If you have that as your person, well, that's going to be tough. I could also conceive of a lot of people who I've worked with who had the fusion occur with the spine in more lordosis. Think about what that person's going to be limited in, especially if it's several levels. If I bring one knee to chest and I can't flex my spine or I can't reverse the lordotic curve, it's going to be struggle bus driving me into counter nutation. That person is going to have a restriction in inhalation-based mechanics. What do? Well, you can't change the structure. You have to do the best you can working within that structure. So you still would go after the same mechanics, but what you might do is you might temper your expectations in terms of how far you would get. Just like I would if I had someone who had severe shoulder osteoarthritis. I might not be able to restore full shoulder dynamics because of structural changes that have occurred. But you could focus your efforts on still improving the mechanics to the best of that person's capabilities. How would you know if someone is fused into more lordosis or kyphosis? Your measures would probably indicate that to some degree, but because you can't change the structure, I would not change your programming. Still drive the stack, still drive inhalation mechanics as needed, still drive exhalation mechanics as needed, and then combine those things working into rotation and other planes where your person might be restricted. And if you do those things, you can bet your bottom dollar that they're probably going to be able to do a lot more activities than they could before the fusion or before they got to working with you. Do not let something like a lumbar fusion be a limiter for you. You can still attain a very high quality of life. My one buddy, who we're pretty sure is fused into lumbar kyphosis, can deadlift 475 pounds last I talked to him. So there's still hope. Just maximize the dynamics as you can. Slowly expose your loading parameters. And if you do those things, even if you are fused as can be, you ought to be in business and you ought to get your life back. Awesome question. I think that's a good stopping point for us today. I want to thank all of you beautiful, sexy, outstanding people for tuning in. I want to make you aware of an opportunity that's available. We have this online human performance summit that's featuring myself and several other of my colleagues in the industry. I will link it in the show notes. I would strongly encourage that you sign up. It's only $15. I'm going to be going through a live, straight up consultation with someone. So if you want to get into the remote business, you want to see how it works. The goal is to take someone, perform an assessment remotely, do some treat interventions remotely, and then write them a program. I'll show you how it's done. Check it out, but you're going to have people ranging from Pat Davidson, Mike Isertel, Dr. Mike T. Nelson, to name a few people, Dr. Jared Boyd, who's with the Memphis Grizzlies. It's a pretty good group, and I think they're also trying to get some more people in. So please check it out, support the fam. I'm going to try to use this so I can, continue to get better equipment and stuff to make this look better, be better for you. That's what it's for. If you want to learn more about what I have to offer you and your boy, or you want to dive into these mechanics more, please check out zachcouples.com. Subscribe to my newsletter while you're there. You will get access to the Human Matrix Foundations course. It's free. It'll help you get the basic mechanics you need to be successful learning these debriefs. You'll get the Common Compensations workbook, which will really simplify the compensatory strategies you see with your clientele. You'll get 5 hours of talks, a free acute to chronic workload calculator, and an email from your boy every Friday giving you the up and up on what's going on with the internets. I also offer several services. When the lockdown is over with, please attend Human Matrix, my seminar. I got a gang of them across the U.S. They'll be linked in the show notes. If you want to apply these concepts with your clients, if you want to simplify the movement process and you want to be coached and taken through some of the maneuvers and the activities that I use with my clientele, or if you want to squat better with your clients, Human Matrix is the way to do it. I also offer movement consultations. If you got a Dowager's hump and you're not sure how to improve your dynamics in the thoracic spine, or you are sucking on your cat-cows, or your clients are, and you want to do better with it, work with me through movement consultation. What that looks like is I will take you wonderful folks through a full body evaluation. You will, folks, be given activities coached by yours truly to maximize your movement options so you can do whatever it is you want to do. If whatever you want to do involves training and you want to improve your fitness, well, respecting your movement capabilities or even improving your movement capabilities, your boy can help you with that as well. Please sign up for online training. If you want to learn how to apply these concepts with your specific population and you're unsure where to start, the mentorship program is a great place to do that. I will consult with you one-on-one. I will teach you what your movement deficits are. We'll work together. You will be given homework and action steps to help apply these concepts with your clients or to learn better, and I will hold you accountable. I will help take you to the next level. Mentorship was critical for me having some success with my clients and doing this. I want to extend that service to you because I know it can be really hard to find good mentors. Once you've scoured ZachCouples.com, you'll want to check me out on Apple Podcasts and Stitcher. Search the Zach Couple Show. Because guess what, folks? There are 117 other debriefs out there. And, you can't take, YouTube on a long walk on the beach or wherever it is you're walking. Please give me a listen on Apple Podcasts and Stitcher. Leave a review while you're there so the fam can keep growing. I'm also on social media, Facebook/ZCouples. The Twitter handle is @ZCouples. I'm on that Instagram, baby. Zach, Z-A-C, Couples, C-U-P-P-L-E-S. And last but not least, find me on YouTube. Search Zach Couples. If you want a gang of exercises that apply these concepts, if you want access to debriefs and other videos, please check me out there. Thank you all for tuning in. You've been an amazing, beautiful, sexy, outstanding audience. I hope you keep it real, but not to the extent where things go wrong. Stay hungry, stay learning, stay moving, and I'll see you next time. Deuces.